Herein is an attempt to try and describe the golden number system for anybody wondering about it. This is actually something that was requested recently, and hopefully this will stand the test of time. And if it doesn't, well, we can always delete it and re-upload it. The golden number is the final score that any given game gets. It is a series of 41 separate calculations that happen after the core points to positives and negatives for story and gameplay are given, to then punch out, here's the golden number. If it's at 0, it's right in the middle. Dead, average, nothing burger, mid, whatever you want to call it. Anything negative is bad. Anything positive is good. That's the summary. It is a linear line, not a logarithmic one. That took some recent work in order to try and make sure that a plus 10 game is roughly the equivalent of a negative 10 game, and so forth and so on. There are three major factors that go into deciding what the golden number is. The first is density. How well does the game utilize its time? How many positives or negatives per hour does it receive? The second is the ratio. Of all of the points given, how many of them are positives and how many of them are negatives? We really only track the positives. So in other words, if it's a 33%, then most of the points are negatives. 50% is even, and then anything above 50% is good. Which of course leads us to variance. What is the gap in between the gameplay and the story? Now that's the summary. There is no real ceiling. There's kind of a hypothetical ceiling. If a game magically got +3 to everything and -3 to everything, that would be our hypothetical ceiling and floor. We'll never see a game like that, and by design, the ceiling and the floor are both designed to be things that move over time. Just this year, we actually made a new top reviewing game 3 separate times, so that's life. But let me describe a little bit more about the philosophy here, if you don't mind my rambling. The idea is, I always wanted some kind of formula to look at the stats and weight them and say, all right, here's your final score. I mentioned that weight part in particular because a lot of times people can and would look at the score, you know, just the +7, +0, +15, -1, -24, +42, and they would say, okay, and you can interpret that however you want, but it was so little data to work from that in some cases it would be misleading. For example, if you see a game that has -24 to story, you might think, oh, that game has a terrible story, and you would ignore the +80 points to story that it already got. It just had more negatives. In other words, a game, this is where the ratio comes in, a game that has +10 -0 is different than a game that has +40 -30, right? Same concept. So trying to get a little bit more information about that, that's where the ratio really started coming in. The first game that really was an impetus for that was Tales of Vesperia, which is quite a while ago at this point, where we were trying to track that, and the game kind of came up like with a dead zero, but it was a dead zero because of the fact that it had so many positives and negatives at the same time. The second thing is, of course, the density. The density should be obvious, but just in case I have to describe it, how much the game does with its time is more important to me than its time. I understand the full details of this. We discuss this almost once a week at this point because it keeps coming up. And I understand that there's a lot of different perspectives on this, but for me personally, I would rather have a game that does a lot with its time than a game that doesn't. In other words, put very, very simply, a 50-hour game that has 10 pluses versus a 1-hour game that has 10 pluses. I'd prefer the 1-hour game because it does more with its time. I don't value empty space. I don't value empty text. I don't value padding. Now, that's just me personally, and I understand that that's not the best way to put that. That's the very nature of the golden number, right? I'll talk about that in a second. So that's your density. That also applies inversely, or I guess multiplicatively, when it comes to the other side of things. If a game is doing really, really badly in a short period of time, that's arguably worse than a game that's doing badly, but only over a long period of time. That, of course, leads us to the weird one. Oh, hang on, I was going to give an example of that. The example I like to go for density is actually Modern Warfare. 1 and 2 both, but 1's the one I usually use, which is like a 4-hour game. But Modern Warfare 1 does so much with its 4 hours that I tend to value it more than, you know, most typical empty 60-hour games. I'm sure most of you probably understand the concept of being kind of bored of big, boring open-world games and preferring something a little bit meatier. So now we talk about the final one, variance. Variance is one of those funny things. I do value variance because for me, what I want out of a game is story and gameplay. And I understand, frankly, that's uncommon. The overwhelming majority of games focus on one or the other, not both. And there's understandable reason for that. Game designers tend to not make good writers and vice versa. And there's other stuff that goes into that, which I will not discuss here, but you can see why it's such a common thing. So, I value the games that nail both aspects of the thing. But the reason it got kind of pulled into the... See, before we started pulling it in as a specific variable, games naturally scored better if they had both, because they just had more points. And then, I'll never forget it, we actually were reviewing the Mega Man series, this was just last year, and several of the Mega Man games were suddenly scoring better than Dragon Age. And I'm just like, hold up. And the reason why was because their density was very, very high, and the gameplay was very, very high, and there was no story on there. And so it was just kind of distending it a little bit. So we came up with the variance variable in order to try and accommodate this a little bit. So games essentially can gain more of their points the more they are spread evenly between the two. And that certainly worked until we found there was another flaw with that. And it's an iterative process. The whole thing, I wasn't joking, it's 41 formulas. At this point, formulas isn't even the right word. This is programming. We have designed a program that goes through several scripts and sequences before it finally punches out the correct thing in order to try and be more accurate about all this. The core philosophy has never really changed, but we're trying to get more accurate with the actual results. So, that's where the variance comes in. And the reason I mentioned the philosophy here, core stats are interesting, but stats can be misleading. Anybody who's ever studied statistics knows, core stats only matter so much as how you interpret them. There's actually 3 layers to that, but I'm not going to go into full depth of this because this is a whole topic, and this is just here to describe the golden number. The example I came up with today, and I like to use for this, is you have 3 cups in front of you. You have to review these. There's a hot cup of coffee, a cold tea, and a Coke, like a soda, right? Review them. And what you value is going to change that. The facts don't change, but what you value changes how much each one scores. If you prefer hot drinks, that's going to score well. If you prefer cold drinks, these 2 will score better. If you prefer carbonation, that one's going to score better. If you don't like caffeine, all of them are going to suck. You get it? And so what I value, and this is the core element of the golden number, and thank you for actually watching this far into this stupid description video, but the core element of the golden number is what I value and what we have decided as a community that we value, because the golden number wasn't built by me, it was built by us. A special thank you and shout outs to Savacom, who's helped me with a lot of the math and the organization behind the scenes and under the hood in order to make these equations happen. So what we have decided we care about is the things I mentioned earlier. How dense is the game? What's the ratio of positives? What is the variance between story and gameplay? And at the end of the day, that punches out the golden number. I am extremely proud of this system. Thank you for listening to my terrible, silly little explanation of it. And I hope this answers any questions you have. If not, well, that's what the comments are for. You can always catch me streaming, too. I do stream 9 hours a day, 7 days a week, so you can probably catch me there. I'll see ya.